Tonight, a top U.S. official calls Canada's multicultural model a failure, but the data reveal a different story.
We trace the coordination, follow the money, and ask why Canada's diversity terrifies nationalist strategists in Washington.
Breaking tonight, America's Vice President just declared war on Canadian identity. JD Vance didn't critique our economy, he attacked who we are. And the timing, suspiciously perfect. Tensions are exploding across North America tonight. JD Vance launched a coordinated assault on Canada's immigration system, but instead of economic analysis, Washington delivered ideological warfare. The man who stands one heartbeat from the presidency just told 39 million Canadians that our multicultural society is, and in his words, immigration insanity. Everyone believed this was just another political tweet. Financial analysts expected standard criticism about GDP numbers. Diplomatic observers assumed Vance would stay focused on trade issues. They were all utterly incorrect. Washington, D.C., November 21st, 2025. Posting from his official account, Vice President JD Vance shared a GDP per capita graph and declared that Canada has embraced what he calls immigration insanity, saying, quote, "No nation has leaned more into diversity as our strength. We don't need a melting pot. We have a salad bowl immigration insanity than Canada." Translation. The future Republican presidential frontrunner just told our entire nation that diversity isn't our strength. It's our weakness. And what happened next? The coordinated ideological attack that connects Yale law classmates, Canadian conservative warriors, and American nationalism reveals exactly why this moment threatens everything Canada has built over decades, while exposing the playbook authoritarians use to divide democracies. But here's the question you should be asking right now. Why did JD Vance wake up one morning and decide Canada, yes, Canada, needed to be his next political target? Was it random? Was it boredom? Or was someone whispering in his ear? Dear viewers, between November 15th and November 21st, 2025, something coordinated unfolded across conservative networks. Jamil Jivani, Vance's old friend from Yale Law School, and now one of Pierre Poilievre's loudest cultural warriors, gave a media interview on November 15th announcing his anti-diversity forum. Then on November 18th, he held that forum in Ottawa, denouncing DEI, multiculturalism, and what he called liberal racism. 3 days later, November 21st, like absolute clockwork, JD Vance posts his graph and calls Canada a multicultural disaster zone. You don't need to be Sherlock Holmes to see the coordination there. This wasn't coincidence. This was an ideological pipeline in real time. Let's break down what Vance actually said, because the details matter. He retweeted a GDP per capita chart showing Canada's numbers declining and wrote, "While I'm sure the causes are complicated, no nation has leaned more into diversity as our strength. We don't need a melting pot. We have a salad bowl immigration insanity than Canada." Then he added this gem. Canadians shouldn't blame Trump for their problems, or whatever boogeyman the CBC tells you to blame. The fault, according to Vance, lies entirely with Canadian leadership. Now pause right there. We're being lectured on economic policy by a man who locked into power by hitching his wagon to someone found liable for sexual assault and convicted on 34 felony counts. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a hockey stick. And JD, if you're watching, Canadians would stop blaming Trump if he would stop shoving his face into our business every 5 minutes. He's had his sights set on this country since January 20th when he was inaugurated, so spare us the victim act. Here's what Vance conveniently ignores when he waves that GDP per capita graph around like it's proof of anything. America looks fantastic on paper, sure. The numbers are impressive. But the majority of Americans never see that wealth because the United States doesn't have a productivity miracle. It has an inequality explosion. 1% of their population owns more than a third of all national wealth. Wall Street firms are buying up family homes. Rents are climbing faster than wages. People working full-time jobs can't afford apartments. That's the dirty little secret behind Vance's beloved graph. It's not measuring how ordinary people are doing. It's measuring how billionaires are doing. Canada's GDP per capita looks lower. Absolutely. But our wealth distribution is more balanced, more equitable, more spread across the population. Most Canadians actually see those economic gains distributed across society instead of funneled exclusively to billionaires. When Vance waves that graph around saying, "Look at America, that's success," he means success for hedge funds and tech moguls, not for the family struggling to afford rent in Phoenix or groceries in Ohio. His beloved GDP number looks great until you ask who's actually getting that wealth. It's like showing off your house's market value while you're sleeping on a cot in the garage. The number sounds impressive, but it doesn't tell you who lives where. The number sounds impressive until you realize who actually benefits. And speaking of leadership, yes, Mark Carney apologized for his "who cares" comment at the G20 about Trump's tariff threats. That apology wasn't weakness, it was strategic brilliance. It made Carney look like a statesman willing to admit mistakes. Carney told Canadians before the election that he'd admit his mistakes. And when he made one at the G20, he did exactly that. Compare that to Trump, who has never apologized for anything ever, including the 34 things a jury convicted him of doing. The difference between those two men isn't subtle. Now, Canada absolutely faces economic challenges. Everyone knows productivity has stagnated for years. Infrastructure investment lagged. Red tape slowed projects. Businesses resisted modernization. These are real problems requiring real solutions. But you know what isn't causing Canada's economic issues? The type of immigrants we welcome. Immigration isn't the culprit. It's not even in the top 5 factors. Vance took a legitimate concern and invented an imaginary cause, because that imaginary cause fits his ideological worldview. And here's the part that should terrify every Canadian watching this video. Canada is finally fixing the structural problems that held us back. In just 7 months since taking office, Prime Minister Mark Carney has accomplished more on economic reform than the previous 3 governments combined. Interprovincial trade barriers are coming down, major infrastructure projects are being fast-tracked instead of studied to death. Clean energy corridors are being built. Northern development is accelerating. Carney is modernizing the entire economic foundation of this country while simultaneously managing our relationship with an increasingly hostile American administration. So the idea that Canada is collapsing under immigration while we're actively rebuilding our economic infrastructure isn't just wrong. It's embarrassingly wrong for anyone repeating it. Which brings us to the coordination angle, because this timing matters more than people realize. Jamil Jivani held his Ottawa forum on November 18th, denouncing diversity policies and multiculturalism. Pierre Poilievre's office promoted the event. Conservative outlets ran with it. Then, 3 days later on November 21st, Vance dropped his graph and his denunciation, using word for word the same framework Jivani had just delivered. Jivani's role became clear. He's the transmission line, carrying American racial politics directly into Canadian political discourse. And Vance spotted an ideological ally worth amplifying. The Toronto Star called it out immediately. Vance isn't analyzing Canada's economy, he's selling a worldview. That worldview says countries aren't defined by shared democratic values, or institutional strength, or economic opportunity, or the choices citizens make together. Countries are defined by who lived there first, by bloodlines, by ancestry, by ethnic homogeneity. That's the core ideology of so-called national conservatism. It's the belief that nations only stay strong if they stay ethnically consistent. When Vance says Canada leaned too far into multiculturalism, he's not talking about GDP numbers. He's talking about identity, about who belongs and who doesn't. And here's the part he conveniently ignores. The United States is a nation built by immigrants. Canada is a nation built by immigrants. If Vance wants a country defined by pure bloodlines and ancestry, he should probably start by acknowledging he's standing on Indigenous land. Because the only people with legitimate claims to that kind of ethnic purity argument are the first peoples of this entire continent. Yet somehow, they never appear in his speeches about national identity. Funny how that works. Vance uses identical language everywhere he goes. Earlier this year in Munich, he warned Europeans they were committing civilizational suicide by accepting refugees. He claimed they'd open floodgates to unvetted immigrants who would destroy Western culture. But here's what he missed. Europeans were proud of accepting refugees. They were proud of standing up for humanitarian values. They were proud of helping people flee war and disaster. Then along comes JD Vance, a guy who's visited Europe maybe twice in his life, telling Germans they should be ashamed of the exact values that defined their post-war identity. That's the damage this worldview causes. It takes society's best instincts, compassion, solidarity, humanitarian aid, and reframes them as weakness. It turns helping refugees into a threat. It transforms diversity from strength into danger. And now, Canada is his latest stage, not because our GDP curve looks bad, but because our successful multicultural democracy contradicts everything he's selling to American voters. Vance wants to turn Canada into a warning for Americans. He wants our diversity to become his cautionary tale. To him, we're not a partner, we're propaganda. A multicultural disaster he can point to whenever he needs to justify exclusionary policies at home. When he attacks this supposed immigration insanity, what he's really doing is comparing two fundamentally different philosophies. Our nation building through openness versus his doctrine rooted in fear. So, why now? 3 reasons. First, Vance is Trump's heir apparent and could be running for president in 2028. He needs to establish his nationalist credentials now. Second, Canada makes the perfect target for authoritarians because we're a peaceful, stable, multicultural democracy, exactly what Vance wants to discredit. And third, Canadian conservatives are already using identical talking points, creating a ready-made audience for his message, which brings us to Pierre Poilievre, who shared the exact same GDP graph and blamed the same person, Mark Carney. According to Poilievre, wherever Carney goes, inflation rises, housing collapses, and living standards fall. If Mark Carney possesses that kind of economic superpower, maybe he should be directing CERN instead of running a country. Here's what matters, though. Vance links that chart to what he calls immigration insanity, while Poilievre uses it to attack Carney's economic record. Different angle, same visual, same political target. This isn't coincidence. It's an ideological pipeline. Jamil Jivani and Pierre Poilievre are building the bridge between American nationalism and Canadian conservatism. They're importing culture war tactics that have poisoned American democracy and trying to transplant them here. And when politicians on both sides of the border start sharing identical charts, identical rhetoric, and identical ideology, we should all pay very close attention. Because this wasn't about economics. It was about shifting blame, shifting culture, shifting identity. It was about dragging Canada into a political project we never signed up for. Vance's attack matters not because it was accurate, it wasn't, but because it represents a coordinated attempt to export American-style division to Canadian soil. So here's what Canadians need to understand. We don't need imported culture wars. We don't need fear campaigns dressed as economic analysis. And we sure as hell don't need politicians borrowing worldviews from the worst actors south of the border. Every time Poilievre shares those same graphs, every time Jivani amplifies American grievance politics, we need to call it what it is, coordinated division. Here's why that matters. This stuff spreads fast once it takes root. You can't pull it out easily. Want proof? Look south. America's entire political system got infected with this divisive playbook, and now they can't even agree on basic facts anymore. Canada can do better. Canada is doing better. And no vice president from a country with more problems than solutions is going to lecture us about immigration policy, while their own citizens can't afford healthcare or housing. Mark Carney is rebuilding this nation's economic foundation. Canadian workers are benefiting from new trade relationships. Our multicultural identity remains our greatest competitive advantage in a globalized world. And JD Vance can tweet all the graphs he wants. It won't change the fundamental fact that Canada is building something America forgot how to create. A society where diversity actually works. If you found this breakdown valuable, hit subscribe to Canada Next, because we cover Canadian sovereignty and geopolitics every single day. We're not here to be polite about misinformation or imported culture wars. So drop a comment below. Do you think Vance's attack was coordinated with Jivani, or was he just bored and needed a new country to misunderstand? Share this video with someone who keeps thinking our problems come from outside instead of recognizing what we're actually building here. Look, everything I've shown you tonight comes from the public data and official reporting, but the conclusions, those are mine. You decide what it means.